This is the roundtable Sensory Entanglements, Decolonizing the Senses. And we would like to start with a territorial acknowledgement that is adapted from one originally crafted by the Feminist Media Studio at Concordia University. While Zoom is the technical custodian of the platform on which we gather, this makes us no less occupants of the multiple territories on which we are all physically located. Concordia University, where this project originated, is situated on the lands of the Kaneyakan Nation. The platform on which we gather also does not emerge out of the ether. It is a product of Silicon Valley, whose shares are up more than 100% since social distancing measures were enacted, even as the economy crumbles around us. Zoom's headquarters are located on Muwekma Ohlone territory. The Ohlone have historically understood about sustainability, about communal societies, about giving gifts to those who pass by, and about sharing space. Their horizontal organization might inspire different emergent models of peer-to-peer networking in the pandemic that we are enacting here in Zoom. We see Zoom as a platform which connects us and also may alienate us from the aims of restitution, justice, and reparation. In connecting us now, it is our hope it might yet take us to those other modes of networking. Now, as way of introducing the roundtable, let me say that collaborative and multimodal, multi-author human and non-human points of view and modes of sensing have been shaping new understandings of the world, conveyed and researched through new media technologies. This roundtable explores how new forms of experimental mediation are making possible a sensing of cultures that challenges colonial ways of knowing and sharing that knowledge. Participants are members of an interdisciplinary team of First Nations, Indigenous, and non-Indigenous artists, scholars, and curators who have been meeting as an intercultural laboratory since 2014. Through meetings, workshops, readings, and research-led discussions, we have shared and learned about each other's practices and ontologies, running all sorts of interferences in our respective modes of thinking and doing. In this process, collaborative teams led by Indigenous artists have drawn from emerging digital technologies to create 3 sensory environments that are being showcased as part of ISEA's artistic program. In the presentation that follows, you will hear from the artists themselves, as well as from 3 of the researchers that are part of the team. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Susan Kite. I'm going to share our presentation.
Hi, I'm Peti Washte, Suzanne Kaitamachi Api, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Hamataha. My name is Suzanne Kite. I am an Oglala Lakota performance artist, composer, and a PhD candidate at Concordia University. I am currently living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is now Muskogee Creek Nation, has been and is now considered. I am going to talk about the project that I have made with my partner Devin Ronneberg for Sensory Entanglements. Next slide. So this project has come out, was developed at a time when I was writing this paper, co-writing this paper, Making Kin with the Machines, and now it's forthcoming as a book. And this thinking about non-humans and kinship has really influenced the making of this sculpture. Next slide. So Vine Deloria Jr. says, respect involves 2 attitudes. One attitude is the acceptance of self-discipline by humans and their communities to act responsibly towards other forms of life. The other attitude is to seek to establish communications and covenants with other forms of life on a mutually agreeable basis. So that is the very center of what we're considering for this sculpture. Next slide. This is, I can't read all this, but basically this is drawn from the research of Dr. Posthumus, who has theorized about Lakota interiority, which is the way I'm thinking about Lakota ontologies, and how the sculpture itself is a non-human with potential interiority. Next slide. So all of this discussion, I interviewed my grandfather, and it's published in South as a State of Mind, and it's available on my website, where I go in depth about what's going on in this sculpture. Next slide. So this is what the sculpture looks like when you stand below it. It's made of song, power, sound, processors, machine learning decisions, handmade circuitry, gold, silver, copper, aluminum, silicon, and fiberglass. We have two versions now. One is ISEA, the other one is Itoapichikola, and it's a sculpture built by myself and my partner, Devin Ronneberg. It's a large acrylic dome hanging from the ceiling, encapsulating two circuits, which are handmade by Devin. These circuits connect a computer to lights and sensors, which are wrapped with leather into 15-foot-long hair braids of synthetic hair. When the sensors are swung, twisted, shaken, or brushed by people, the braids feed that data into circuits and then the computer, which in turn affects the audio heard in the gallery. And that audio is a voice reciting a song in Lakota, and it drops in and out of audibility. It's low and rumbling, and a radio jumps around the dial. Voice is almost perceivable, but during this, ISEA software listens to those audio changes and uses machine learning to make decisions about how and when to change the constellation of lights. Next slide. This is the song that I was prompted to write in conversation with my cousin Corey Stover. And this is what's heard in the gallery. Next. This is what the sculpture looks like from a little bit of a distance, installed at the Bemis Center of Contemporary Art. Next slide. So with ISEA, we attempted to set up a sense of relationality between the human walking through the gallery and the computer as a system, but that vague relationality is absolutely not enough on its own. So I spent a lot of time wondering about what the difference between relationality in art context and relations in Lakota context, what the differences were. Because the frameworks here are not rituals, they are ethical processes where we're defining who's who and what we're in relation to. So the reason there's song in this is because when we asked Corey Stover for advice on how to approach the metals in the system, he suggested that the metals have a ghost wrenched from the earth, and suggested listening for its name, listening for a song, and asking forgiveness for the process by which it was removed from the ground. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, great. This is us asking forgiveness and doing a blessing when we first installed it, myself and Corey. Next slide. So during the making this process, I was also involved in this Indigenous protocols and artificial intelligence workshop, and that's where I kind of took the ideas that I worked through with the sculpture and really exploded them into a paper called How to Build Anything Ethically. I think, how much time do I have left? I can't hear you.
$30 seconds or so.
Okay. Well, let's skip forward to the a few ways. Yeah, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So from making the sculpture, I'm thinking through the protocol stream of what it took to make this sculpture in a good way, and how it was a total failure because it didn't happen in a good way. But I was thinking through consultation all the way through a death cycle, what's possible. Next slide. And so I think, in thinking about this sculpture, I'm trying to imagine how all these protocols can feed together to make one one sculpture in a good way through all of these streams of protocol coming together. Next slide. And so I'll end with a quote from my grandfather. He says, "I believe this about stones. Whenever one comes to you, whenever it rolls to you, or whenever it's right in front of you, that it's there for a purpose, here to teach your spirit something, so that maybe what it teaches you, you can use to help someone else." Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is David Garneau.
Sorry, something happened on my screen. Hi, thanks very much. My name is David Garneau, and I bring greetings and offer respect for Treaty 4 territory of Turtle Island, home of the Cree, the Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Métis, which is my nation. I'm in Regina, which is Wascana, or Pile of Bones, and I'm going to talk about Heartband. So Heartband is an installation about 3 meters by about 1 meter. It's an array of 10 hand-painted drums that go in a figure 8 or an infinity symbol, which is also the Métis flag. And Indigenous nations tend to center around the idea of circles and cycles. And I want to use this symbol because it's a circle, a cycle, but it's complicated. It's the idea of bringing in 2 nations, 2 modes of thought together. And I entered this project with Garnet Willis, who was my collaborator, with a sense of trepidation. We weren't collaborators at first. It was going to be my thing. I was going to come up with the ideas, and he was going to make the electronic stuff that I didn't know how to do. But as we went along, it really became a collaboration, and we had to retitle or rethink ourselves. And initially, I want to make seemingly or completely material things, but Indigenous things like drums speak. So I wanted to have a table with these works on them that would then, if you put your ear close, it would trigger and you would hear sounds of an elder talking about the making of the very drum. And I had a drum built by a local elder who was actually also a chief. And then I felt that it would be a desecration to animate this. The thing has its own animation, and its use or its being, proper being, is when it's in relation to the body that's drumming. And so I felt like this project was not a correct one, even though I saw a certain kind of appeal to it. And so when we came up with this array, this figure 8 of 10 drums is at an angle, the drums themselves are artificial drums. So I didn't want handmade drums, but artificial store-bought drums that I thought would echo with the electronic or artificial nature of the piece we're making. And so what it is, it's a musical instrument. The drums play themselves, but require the proximity of a body. So the 10 drums each has a sensor, and it picks up from about 8 feet away. As you're walking towards it, you hear a heartbeat, and as you get closer, the heartbeat gets louder and faster. And so I imagine people coming into the space and moving back and forth with it, or eventually my great hope was that a dancer or 2 would interact with it. And the notion was very similar to what Suzanne Kite was saying, is this notion of relation. So I'm interested in memorials, living memorials, or living works of art. And for me, they become living. They may have a being by themselves that we're not aware of, but when we come in relation to them through visiting, we enact another way of being, and it's a being in relation. Whatever being they had on their own is one thing, but when the thing has a being in relation to us, it has another. And there's a long tradition, certainly in Western art and in all nations' art, of an artwork being completed when the eyes are painted in, or when it's being touched, or when it goes in its particular spot, and before that it's not animated. And so I'm very interested in this sense of animation that we feel, and then when this object then actually corresponds with that and actually expresses itself and sets up a rhythm that wouldn't have existed without the other body. I'm really interested in this interrelation. And so that in this project we were able to attract Zab Mabugu to dance with it, it became an entirely different thing. And The pandemic didn't allow me to be there. Though I was there virtually, and that was a really terrific thing because then the object had a life of its own and wasn't burdened by my authorship. That said, as we can see in the details, these drums are painted with some of them are Métis motifs. They come from history, but they're also almost all of them, pretty much all of them, are in relation to bodies in sight. So I was trying to get a notion that people would have some relation to it through birds or eyeballs or hearing. They would get all the senses engaged, but there's a particular set of meanings that I think a Métis person would derive differently. And so there's meanings that suggest that this is a portal through to another mode of being. And I'm interested in Métis being because it is a contingent site, a site of this collaboration and collapse of two sets of nations coming together, but to make a new third thing, which isn't quite one, not quite the other, and something different than a mere combination.
Thank you, David. I am now going to play a 30-second excerpt, I'm sorry, from the performance of the dancer Sab in interaction with Heartband. I'm gonna. Our next is David House. Just a minute, David, you're muted, I think.
Thank you, Florencia. I'd like to begin by reading a brief excerpt from an essay by Chris Salter, published in the Visual Anthropology Review, which sets the stage for the Sensory Entanglements project. He said, the team is attempting to explore the productive tension in how the newness of emerging technologies, despite their colonial origins and structures, might enable an indigenizing of sensorial artistic experiences that disrupts historical boundaries, challenges entrenched borders, and creates potential forms of culturally specific empathy, potentially may decolonize the representation of otherness. So what the group has been engaged in creating are a series of performative sensory environments, which are responsive to those who interact with them. That is, they are deliberately there to be interacted with by an audience. And the idea is that this should be, or create, a context for a new kind of intercultural understanding. And the important thing about these environments is precisely that they're not screen-based. And so I'm sure you can appreciate how much of a challenge it was for all of us to find out from the ISEA 2020 organizers that we would have to present the artworks to you via a screen. And in that regard, David Garneau responded to the situation ingeniously by seeing it as an opportunity instead of an obstacle, and inviting Zab to come and perform the drums. So this involved a very interesting triangulation. It isn't just the interaction between the object and an audience, but rather now what you have is a Métis object, and whoever the audience might consist of, mediated by an African dancer. And so this went beyond the ideas of intercultural exchange that we started with. And I was present at the filming of Zab's performance. And I must say that I could only describe it as a rapturous one. Now, David was present because that's his heartbeat that you're hearing. And indeed, as Zab moved in and out of the drums, the heartbeat would get louder or softer and also increase in frequency or not. So she was playing David's heart, and she did so in an extraordinary way because, of course, these drums she never touched. She played them with her movement. It's like that Russian instrument, the theremin, where instead of actually blowing into an instrument or drawing a bow across it or any other of the physical manipulations we're used to, it is the motion of the body that is actually drawing out the sound, drawing out the spirit of the object. And Zab, in interacting with these drums, discovered ways of playing them that were truly extraordinary. They lost the pattern of a heartbeat and became musical phrases, became actual expressions. And I was especially astonished by the way in which, when she would discover a sweet spot, like between these two drums that you're seeing right now, she would move different parts of her body. So her torso, her chest, her pelvis, her feet, and in this way create these different musical phrases. So drums are to be struck. No, she didn't strike them. She did put her hand on occasion on the drum with the symbol of a hand on it. But that was an act of communion, not of playing. And so actually our experience, and you'll see this better even in the longer video, is mediated by her movement. And therefore you have a Métis work of art, translated through a form of African dance. The last moves in the dance consisted of her balancing on one foot, leaning backwards. I was seated on the floor right underneath her at this moment, arching her back and extending one foot towards the drum so that it was the sole of her foot that connected with the drum. And she held that pose, an impossible pose, for close to 35 seconds, and then began whirling in an extraordinary series of twirls around the drums, and then finally came to a standstill and brought the drums to silence as well. And that was the end of the performance. There are many, many things to be said about the whole philosophy of the dance that she enacted in the course of her exposition. We had a long opportunity to talk afterwards, and I will bring out some of those points in the discussion. Right now, what I'd just like to emphasize is the way in which she played these drums with her movement, and the rhythms that she drew out were truly an ecstasy for all involved. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Ree.
Hi everybody, my name's Ree. I'm from the Gamilaroi Wallowan people from the central west of New South Wales and in Australia, and also from the Biripi people from the coastal area of a small part of New South Wales. I'm currently on the Awabakal people's country in Newcastle, just a couple of hours out north of Sydney. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work called, or it's titled Pause. So it's actually not the final iteration for this this project. So it's the first iteration actually. So it's a video work that will evolve into a three-dimensional installation, sound-based work that has sensor-driven interaction in it. But for the purpose of this current presentation, the work is a single-channel video, and eventually the layers will be broken up. So the work itself is actually part of my thesis work. It's called Pause because the work in itself is actually about those moments in my life as an Indigenous person where I've come across certain things that have stopped me in my tracks, made me think about who I am, think about how I want to make work about that, how do I carry that story forward. And it's also a play on the, play, pause, record technology layers in which I kind of work or have worked in this particular work. So I work across a very diverse range of technologies. This particular work, the content of the work is actually about going back to country as an adult and examining the ways in which my body physically and mentally and emotionally deal with trauma, generational trauma. And so there's a rhythm in the work, which is why there's a dancer there, and the work is quite abstract. So the work in itself isn't about a linear story. It's about the past and the present and what the future might reveal. And so the dancer is going through these different kind of moments. He's struggling. He's in different parts of the environment. He's been impacted by different moments in his life, and so he's therefore kind of reflecting those moments in relation to my practice and my own journey in that process. So and of course this end slide, he finds himself jumping into the world, and of course he gets shot. And so it feels like for me as an Indigenous person, an Indigenous artist, that no matter what direction I go, I end up back in the same place, and I just take a new direction in my work and make another layer that reveals a different part of the narrative. So it feels like, I think for me, where I am in my practice now is I guess reiterating this story in different kind of ways. Thanks.
Thank you, Ree. Our next speaker is Jennifer Biddle.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Biddle. I'm a non-Indigenous anthropologist speaking to you today from the east coast of Australia, land that belongs to Gadigal and Bidjigal peoples of the Eora Nation. By means of giving you some sense of our project, I want to briefly engage with the creative works in the project. Works by Suzanne Kite and Devin Ronenberg, David Garneau and Ree, which, while vastly differing, nevertheless share, it seems to me, certain formal strategies within what are deeply inequitous ways of seeing and ways of sensing. Taking shape as they do within what Kanahake Mohawk Audra Simpson might call settler colonial visual expectations, an economy of rights to look defined by overdetermined scripts of extractivist logics and consumer expectations, funnel neck reductive frameworks and demands to commodify high Aboriginal authentic culture and vanishing pillow paradigms of once was glory. These works then are deeply cognizant of their significance within this economy, operating to refuse simple takeaways by multi-layered correctives, which, as Simpson might say, quote, skewer the ontologies of governance that set up the inequitous expectations of viewing publics. So, how so? What are the formal properties of this skewing of audience expectations? 3 quick points. Firstly, spatial relationality. The work's foreground spake as an ontological primacy in Keit's and Ronenberg's Telling Rock. A radically preoccupied space is literally in your face in the gallery. Her 15-foot long leather-laced braids of synthetic hair cannot be walked past, avoided, or dodged. Here, a bodily interruption to the right to move through space, panoptical visuality, unilineal gaze, uninterrupted, unencumbered, and the right to move through unoccupied space as if terra nullius, unmoved or unhalted by Indigenous prior occupation. 2. Time, temporal disruption. There is waiting, slow engagement, a leaning in, and learning required. In the video performance of David Garneau's Hot Band, we see Zab time and again repeat and retrace her movements to learn the drum machine response, her becoming machine, or making kin with the machine, as Kite develops the concept in her analysis of her own work of the Lakota-derived enduring ethical relatedness required with the non-human machinic of the contemporary and for Indigenous futurity. In Ree's work, this temporal enduredness is almost unbearable. The kangaroo turned tutu-adorned human shapeshifter moves in space ungrounded, and nowhere, everywhere, or perhaps everywhen, as Yamachi art historian describes Aboriginal temporality. But here, the durative is screamingly colonial, occupied, awaiting to be hit for burdens. Trauma, precarity, an enemy unnamed, unknown, and ubiquitous saturates. 3. Sonic sovereignty. Kite describes her work to listen without ears, and it is from the hand to braid, swung, shaken, twisted branch network of engagement on offer through which response takes shape. The animate sculpture lights up sound and light through the agency of repeated movement. The voice of the Lakota may boom, but the words are barely audible. Static feedback, mechanical silence, glitches, breech lips, forked tongues. A word, maybe two, most we are able to hear. We listen hard, but cannot know or possess, protecting perhaps as well as promoting, it seems to me, what are more intangible aspects of cultural heritage. People, do you see what is not seen? Her Lakota poem pointedly asks. Arguably, then, these 3 works are not works of counter-history or counter-memory. No narrative or evidentiary fact is simply on offer. Rather, it seems to me these works operate as intervention and instigation, each a distinctive, irreconcilable space of Indigenous sovereign engagement, perhaps in David Garneau's terms, precisely because they cannot be easily apprehended or readily appropriated. Taking shape within thresholds of sensory capacities deeply under occupation, they inaugurate and require slow, durative, feltful spectatorship in participatory modes of affective response. Partial, incoherent, disoriented, more than simply decolonial, these works indigenize a threshold space between the more tangible and intangible, human and machine and ancestral in new ethical configurations and command.
The next and final speaker is Chris Salter.
The Cameroonian philosopher Chaine1 talks about the idea of, he calls the ordeal of the world. And in this ordeal of the world, he asks an interesting question that is very much, I think, surrounding us and embellishing us right now, which is, he asks, can the other, in light of all that is happening, still be regarded as my fellow creature? When the extremes are broached, as is the case for us here and now, precisely what does my and the other's humanity consist of? The other's burden, having become too overwhelming, would not be better for my life? Would it not be better for my life to stop being linked to its presence as much as to my own? Why must I, despite all opposition, nonetheless look at the other, stand as close as possible to her or his life, if in return his or her only aim is my ruin? Quote. Now, this question of otherness is something that, of course, is surrounding us at the moment. Is we are embedded in every facet, whether the other is our fellow human beings or the other is a invisible 150 micron entity called a virus that we have no visible understanding of, but certainly many people's bodies certainly have experience of. There's another term that is, I think, very appropriate for many of the works you've seen here, from Rhee's work on pause, Suzanne's work on the relationship of making kin with machines, or with David's work on a kind of way that heartbeats transfer between and in bodies. And that's the idea from the great and late biologist Lynn Margulis, called symbiosis. And, you know, you've heard this term before, but symbiosis is essentially sim, which is the Greek word for together, and bios, which is life. And in biology terms, symbiosis is essentially, Margolis's definition is the living together in physical contact of organisms of different species. So it's the idea of living together with different entities. And what these projects demonstrate is this need and a need to understand this complex relation between us and what we might consider these other forms of life. These other forms of life are, of course, human life with all of its symbolic and cultural weight, but also the life of machines, and also the life of materials, and finally the life of entities that we cannot see, whether it's the virus, whether it's the actual physical or chemical composition of the earth that we all live and breathe on itself. So I think what's very interesting about all these projects, and what was the aim of this quite long and complex conversation that has resulted in material manifestations of symbiosis and experience, is to try to grapple with what is this otherness? What is this otherness of technology? What is this otherness that we think of as cultures that are not our own? What is the relationship between, in this sense, indigenous and non-indigenous life and cultures, and how those can intersect and make kin with each other. And so I think many of the projects you've seen here, our attempt has been to set up an intercultural kind of experiment and lab to research those questions and to see how they might manifest in experiences. And as David said, you know, these are works that are meant to challenge and mesh the whole sensorium: seeing, touching, smelling, tasting, being, hearing, and also, of course, being aware of one's proprioception, one's position in space, one's sense of time. And of course, because of the other, or the symbiosis, we might say, of the world, we've had to transform. All of this is online, and therefore you were getting one aspect of these projects, but as Rhee said, the iterations are in the background, somehow haunting and being present, even though their form may not be that fully embodied experience that we imagined.
Thank you, Chris.
Hello, and thank you so much for all of this rich land to walk through. Before I begin any comments, I need to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Treaty 6 territory and the ancestral land of the Métis. And for this, I offer my respect and gratitude to the Neha, Nakota, Lakota, Anishinaabe, Saulteaux, Dene, Métis, and Michif past, present and future ancestors of this land, and I affirm our relationship with one another. Beginning with that relationality, I think, is key to the conversations that have been laid out before us. And given the questions established for ISEA 2020, I think it might be reasonable to begin here with an idea brought forward by Zoe Todd, which is that ontology is just another word for colonialism. I think a lot about this idea, and I see it brought forward, particularly in Kite's work, where she asks specifically the question of determinations of ontologies and assignment of being as being indicative of one's worldview, belief systems, and an engagement with other, not the other, but with other than ourselves. I also wanted to call into the room Elwood Jimmy and Vanessa Andreotti and their idea of exiled sensibilities, because I think I've heard this notion in much of what's been said here today about sort of a severed connection to the sensorium and a desire to re-engage it when perhaps it has not been lost for us all, or what are the factors that have caused this damage, and can we identify them together through the kind of making thinking or thinking making that this group has proposed for us. So we have a very rich question coming from the audience, and I will get to that, Ben Bogart, and I see that people are responding well to that idea. But I'd like a moment to tease out a few more of the things that have been presented here for us, because I think there's so much richness. And I would also deeply encourage people to visit the works available in the online exhibition to have a stronger understanding of the works presented by Kite and Devin Ronenberg, Ree and David Garno and his collaborator. To really tease out this conversation, one must experience it, even as David House has pointed out, this kind of screen relation will not allow us to do the kind of brushing up against that Kite and Devin referred to so much of the relationality one must enter into to experience in a way that one can actually hear. And I'm going to use that term hearing as it relates to listening, as teased out as something that's not necessarily audition. It's not something that necessarily that we hear, but it refers to the kinds of resonance that you are all speaking to quite specifically, and talking about potential for reception and perhaps increasing our capacity to receive as being this move towards a decolonial perspective. So I'm going to sort of mention with each of the artists particular points, and perhaps that will expand larger conversation, because I'm quite taken with all of the work, and particularly the opportunities you've afforded us to imagine contact. And I use that term quite specifically when I think about Ree's discussion of contact with country, what it was to have this peripatetic experience that is linked to culture in ways that someone outside of that culture cannot necessarily fully understand, but is made quite clear within the work. I think about David's understanding that the drums could not be real drums. They had to be representation, because one cannot animate something which is already animate itself. And then particularly, I'm thinking about the materiality that's described by Suzanne and Devin when they make the listing of the materials of the work. They begin with the material of song. And I would really like to tease that out a bit more, because this really pointed me towards the notion of listening, because the song itself that is spoken, sung in Lakota, includes the words of you watch, but you never hear. It does this switching between the visual primacy of sort of Western thinking since so-called Enlightenment, and does this troubling, or this perhaps productive tension of suggesting that there's a listening that could happen if one were able to hear. And I wonder if Suzanne, if you might address that a little bit. This language you've brought forward that has refused full audition, and then this idea of only those that could hear.
Sure, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so that is listing the, it's funny because listing what the piece was made of materially was really, really helpful, and is generative for me to keep trying to examine. The question that I originally asked myself, which I came from this Indigenous Protocols and AI workshop, somebody asked me, oh, where do you think AI is located? And I think that's different for each person, and each very contextualized, location-based ontology. But for this piece, I really wanted to identify, okay, where is the AI? Is it the code that in the machine learning? Is it that algorithm? But no, we decided that it was, in conversation with my cousin Corey, that it was probably in the song, because if one of the problems I have with artificial intelligence as like a term is it puts intelligence on top, in a hierarchy, where from what I've learned about Lakota values, intelligence is pretty low because it's pretty knowable, and the more unknowable something is, the higher priority of specialness, and something we should look for and protect. And so song, that's why song is listed first, because the song is what comes from elsewhere. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say.
Well, I think that's a fantastic answer, because it also points to, in your production of that work, when you and Devon are describing it, you describe that all of the things that bring the sonic into the arena are then listened to, and they are listened to, and then that drives the constellation from above. So the kind of circularity of the project also refers to the constellation of these lights in a very unique way that I think touches on something that Ree brought forward in their work, which was addressing how all the relations were now the stars and the sky. And I'm very struck by this connection between who will be listening, what will be produced, and then some of these correlations. And Ree, I wonder if you can address this idea of the move from below to above, and how that relates in ideas of kin and connection.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think the work in itself, when I started to kind of make this work, sat really in a very kind of realistic landscape. And as I kind of worked through and got much more kind of connected to the physical senses in terms of the body and the sound, the work itself began to change. And the physical kind of the reality of the landscape became like an abstraction, really. So the elements in our environment that were symbolic in terms of ancestral kind of connections became much stronger, and a much, I guess, a much more kind of focused, poetic kind of sense of energy. And so the dancer then worked through this kind of journey of experiencing by the way, the dancer is actually representative of me. and the dancer is expressing and exploring this kind of connection to country, the presence of ancestral energy, the relationship to sound, and the connections that all of these kind of bring in a kind of physical sense. And so that's why the work in itself has moved from this kind of idea of a two-dimensional video projection idea to a more physical surround kind of sound and visual experience that's kind of driven, while the visuals are actually really strong, this work is actually a sound-driven sensor experience. And I mean, most people who, people who see it who might not necessarily kind of understand the sound context of the work will experience it in a very different way, but in its actual final form, it is actually driven by sound, and the actual physicality of the energy in the work that's explored is really the struggle. I mean, the dancer is exploring the struggle of this colonial system that continues to kind of occupy the spaces in which we work, in which we live and breathe and explore our lives. So it's a complex, as all of the artists will probably relate to, it's a very complex kind of space to operate in, because you seem to be always operating from the internal outwards. And so operating in that space is a very kind of difficult space, and is a kind of personal traumatizing space in its own right. So I guess, yeah, hopefully people will eventually down the track get to experience it in a different way. But at the moment, like everything we're experiencing in the world, it's on a flat screen.
Thank you so much, Ree. It's one of the things I was struck with is in your conversation that's available in these mini documentaries on the website, you talk about this dancer as, in some ways, your avatar or your stand-in, and you explain the rationale for that. But I'm also deeply struck by the dance that they ensue in. This morning I was having a conversation about different kinds of dance representative of certain cultural norms and how they occupy space. And in particular, we were talking about the jingle dance. So jingle dress dancers have very small steps, and they take very little space in comparison to, let's say, a Bhangra dancer or the dancer that was standing in for you, who actually took a great deal of space. And I think that at core with colonial practices is always going to be the idea that land is supposed to go back. Like this is a core belief and premise, is that there's got to be a return. And that's a complicated thing to tease out here, but I think it's central to how we occupy space and how we do that through both sound and physical operations and iterations. And all of you have addressed this idea that the practices you're engaging in are iterative, that there will be new versions of them. In Chaine and Devon's work, there actually are already 2 versions. That with David's work, I'm sorry, with David and I'm forgetting his name. Please excuse me. The collaborator, because I know it didn't begin as a collaboration and then it became a collaboration, so I apologize for that. And I appreciate you acknowledging that shift. But thinking about how in your work with the infinity symbol, the circle 8, the Métis flag, the 8 drums are oriented in such a way that they actually invite engagement and suggest a relationality, but they also occupy space in a unique way that is a refusal of stoppages. You know, like we're seeing in all of these works, is there's this there's an above below, there's a persistence of relationality. And when we get to see Zamagumbu dance with your work, you do see this thing happen that sort of resists a stoppage again. It no longer is able to stay only within a particular kind of space, and it takes a new space in the way it is performed, I'm going to say, because you've described that work as an instrument. And I'd like to pick that up as well. Each, like, is Kite and Devon's work an instrument? And David, you say you have produced an instrument. Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I just want to go back to the way you began in this notion that somehow Indigenous thinking is non-ontological. So an ontology is just means a study of being, and Indigenous people are obsessed with studying being and studying beings. And I think you're thinking about a hierarchical ontology, but even then, Indigenous thinking isn't so different from Western in terms of, even when Suzanne was talking, she described an ontological hierarchy where some things were more valued than others. It's just that it's so shifted, it's so different from Western ways of thinking, and putting relationality and one's relation into as the dominant hierarchy, ontological hierarchy, means that you see things in a really different way. So in terms of those drums, I'll be honest, originally I had an elder, a chief, actually a regional chief here, make a drum with me, and I was for me, and I was going to use that at the beginning. And then I felt that it was a already sacred object. It was already a work of art, and for me to do something with it, to paint on it, to bring it into this electronic environment, felt like a violation, that it might not be correct thing to do. And so I elected to use plastic drums because I felt that they were ontologically, oops, sorry, I thought they were ontologically lesser than the smoked hide drum handmade by this person that I knew. And then I thought, how do I redeem the thing and make it a living object? And for me, it was an inanimate object. You know, it came from sources of things that were animate, but had been divorced from those sources. How could I reanimate it and give it a new life? And so I painted it. That was my first go-to gesture. Then Garnet actually brought my heartbeat, my actual heartbeat, into the drum. And that was another level. And we kept tinkering with that for months, maybe even a year. But I knew all along that it had to be danced with. Another body, not me, had to be involved. And to me, that's part of an Indigenous way of doing things too, is that it's not my thing anymore when it's in the world, it's passed on. And when Zab danced with it, I was so surprised. She took it, treated it sort of cautiously, stiffly, and moved into it and did something that was maybe partway between how she would dance normally and then how she needed to dance with this new object. And so it had a different kind of life. I'm still mesmerized by that, and I look forward to seeing it in the flesh.
Thank you for clarifying Zoe Todd's comment on ontology and colonialism. I think it's really key here, and her comment really is about that hierarchy that you're describing, David. So thank you for teasing that out a little bit further. Obviously, all of the ideas we're dealing with here are so incredibly rich that they take way more time than we've got. And I'd like to bring others into the room now that are on the panel to add to this idea. David Howes had talked so much in his presentation about how he had wanted to address this relationality between Zab and the drums, but he also highlighted Chris Salter's notion of productive tensions. And I'm wondering if you might like to re-enter what you would want to say about dance with relation to that work, David, and if you imagine any of these actions to be productive tensions.
Thank you very much, Jake, for that invitation to comment on what is indeed a very rich interaction. Maybe I can just say about the Sensory Entanglements project. I'm an anthropologist involved in it, but it's ultimately this intercultural, transnational collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars and artists, bridging Canada and Australia. And what I think is remarkable about this association is precisely the way in which it gets us outside of philosophy. I've heard a lot of Deleuze and Guattari at this conference. And my problem with depending on Deleuze and Guattari is that you don't get outside of the West. Kind of solipsism to that. And so we've heard ideas about hearing, very different from conventional Western understandings of hearing or even philosophies of hearing from Suzanne. We've understood things about heartbeats from the interaction between David, heartbeat and Zab, that result in what I would like to think of as a rearrangement of the senses, an opening of a crack in the Western sensorium that can in turn both enhance cross-cultural communication, but also reveal sort of multiple ontologies instead of just one. So I think the real value of the kinds of interactions that this project has been involved with, it's not as though anthropologists are highlighted here. They are part of the conversation. And that conversation has importantly transgressed all kinds of boundaries, interrogated technologies, for example, and also resulted in certain reservations, like David Garneau not being willing to paint a drum created by an elder, not being willing to make that part of the show. So there were things held back here, as well as openings in all kinds of new directions as a result of the alternative ways in which these artworks have crossed the senses, combined ontologies, intersected ontologies, and indeed thereby revealed a multiple world in place of the unitary world of the various varieties of Western philosophy.
Thank you, David. I think in many ways you've brought forward the question that has come from the audience, and there's two that I see to be quite important here, and maybe one before the other, because I think the first question might involve a refrain from Jennifer Biddle and from Chris Salter. So I'd like to bring forward a question from Ben Bogart in the audience, which was, how can we decolonize anthropological perspectives? Why are presumably non-Indigenous anthropologists' perspectives highlighted in this panel? And I'll just note, David Howes did already discuss this idea of highlight versus participation, but I'd like to leave it open to the other panelists to perhaps step in. Jennifer, would you like to speak to that?
Hi, thanks, Jake. And hello, I'm speaking to you from Gidggal and Gadigal country of the Eora Nation here in Sydney this morning. And I'd like to acknowledge Indigenous people here and present in the panel as well as in the audience. Great question, guys. I should start out by saying that the point of the project was not to decolonize anthropology. The Sensory Engagement Project, which is indeed this transnational Indigenous, non-Indigenous designers, anthropologists, artists, curators, academics, writers, activists, all working together, was not really about decolonizing anthropology, although I appreciate that may also be something that we are all undertaking. I suppose there's a couple of things that might be said here. One is that one of the most important things, historically at least, as an anthropologist I'm speaking, and thinking through what we were trying to do in bringing together this network of people asking related but very, very different kinds of questions in the project, was to decenter the assumptions around a unitary body and a singular sensorium. So a lot of what we were trying to do in working with machines and working cross-culturally and working cross-colonially in two contemporary continuing colonizing states of Australia and Canada, i.e. Turtle Island, was to decenter certain kinds of assumed perspectives of ontological primacy, which were a singular sensorium and a singular kind of embodied experience, and indeed a certain kind of assumption about technology. So this project then I saw as bringing the diversity of new media experience and new media histories, which I understand is deriving from First Nations people who are themselves driving innovation in new media, I've got a very long history working in that field, as indeed the artists who are in this project are leading transformations themselves in what media does, what media can do, and specifically what it can do by forming and forging. And I think that's what we see in David Garneau's, Suzanne Keit's, and Rhee's work, is forging new kinds of relations that absolutely challenge notions about what machines are, what bodily experience is, what it is to be occupied, what it is to occupy ourselves now in these machinic spaces and worlds, and the inequities, I suppose, that exists in the kinds of relations that are being reformulated through this work. So decolonizing, yes. Indigenizing, I think, is Stephen Gilchrist would say, or, you know, Lakotaizing or Métisizing. I don't know. I'm really reticent to use those words as a non-Indigenous person. But I am super interested in the capacities for radical instigations and the halting and the slowing down that is required by these works to enter, and the idea of the portal, the idea of a very different way of being required to engage, and the sensorial requirements specifically of relations that challenge, determine, and fail, I suppose, with our own expectations, whoever we are. And I think also, just on one final point, is that these works, it seems to me, also speak to diversities of audiences. You know, David Garneau talked about this earlier too, that Métis audiences, or in Suzanne's work, obviously Lakota people would hear differently, experience differently. I think also the breaking with an assumption that whatever the spatiality of the white cube is, also needs to be thought about very seriously here. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. Jennifer Biddle, thank you. There's such great questions coming from the audience, and I want to, I know that you've addressed that you did not feel this was a decolonization project, so I'm going to defer one of these questions till a little bit later. We have, unfortunately, very little time left, but I was wondering if Chris Salter could enter into this, because obviously, as the PI of a project, you've had much to do with its structuring, and you started your presentation with an identification of the other. And I find this is one of those things that can end up kind of biting us back, because it persists in a different distanciation that may be problematic. And so thinking about the questions that are coming, that are very much addressing decolonialization and the problematics of metaphor, as brought forward through Yves Tuck and Tuck and Yang's incredible essay, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which may not have been in everybody's reading packet for the book today. But given that that is such a key text to moving towards legitimate change, thinking about this idea of reusing terms like the other, the utility of that, and how do you wish to kind of bring that forward in a way that will be generative and future, provide futurity here? Chris, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry, so I'm Chris Salter, talking to you from Berlin, Germany at 22:53 in the evening. First, I want to just say really fast how this project came about, because I think it's appropriate. It came about actually in ISEA 2013 when Rhee and I were on a panel together with Jennifer and in Sydney, and we began to talk about this thinking of how relationality emerges out of the senses, and from the and that was very interesting in that ISEA, because there were no keynotes who were Indigenous in Australia, which was quite shocking. We had a lot of discussion about that, and from the start, as Jennifer said, the project was not about decolonizing anthropology. Anthropologists who were brought into the project, David and Jennifer, were interested because of their interest in the senses and the question of sensory difference.
And I think this is a very key point of this entire project, is that the senses are not the same. They're not the same in different cultures, and the modalities of sensation are not the same as either. From hearing to seeing to proprioception to the sense of time, as I pointed out in my presentation. So we were trying to understand how to test, how to create a kind of let's say a test case of what really constitutes sensory difference, and that's why we reached out to our Indigenous colleagues. And to say, well, that's why we constituted the project as Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and it combines different disciplines and different perspectives on how the senses operate in the world. And so there's multiple perspectives in this project operating, but one of the principal ones was really the question of sensory relationality, as David Garneau talks about, this relationality idea as opposed to a hierarchy idea. And this is emerging more and more in cognitive science, as many people know, is that there's not necessarily a hierarchy of the senses, there's not necessarily modality appropriateness, there's in fact this kind of shifting, a kind of continual palette of how sensory perception works, and certain senses get accentuated and other ones don't. Things fall in the background, things fall in the foreground, so things are much more fluid as opposed to this kind of traditional notion from Aristotle of seeing, smelling, seeing, hearing, smelling, and so on, the higher and the lower senses. So that was really the motivation of the project. And so it was very much looking at the senses from this cultural difference point of view. The question of otherness is interesting, and that's why I bring up the Membe quote, because it's about othering. And we see that Maybe ask, like, how do we still need the other, and how do we understand the other being not us? And it's interesting because, of course, he's playing off this dichotomy between us and something else, and we see that, of course, amplified. This is the whole point of this ISEA, amplified right now so strongly. We face, of course, another other. Something we can't see, something we can't touch, that is shaping relations now, and we are part of that that relationality and that shaping, that intertanglement or that entanglement that's occurring. So I think very much everyone is interested in this question of difference. Not necessarily in terms of, let's say, across all these different categories of cultural, cognitive, affective, and social and political difference. And this is very much where this project has emerged and has been evolving over the past 5 years.
Thanks very much, Chris. Everybody on the chat is acknowledging that this is a really important way to understand the origins of a project that I think actually starts to point to some of the dangerously reductive responses that people are having in this moment, where we are not being as generous or generative as we can be with understanding the series of relations that it takes to arrive at a level of conversation of this sort of breadth. And of course, without the presence of the objects as necessary, and because the objects that we're describing here, Avery, David, Willis, and Kite and Devin, these are experiential works. They are not simply to be engaged with the eye, and certainly not through the haptic media of the screen. And while we are able to understand that the screen itself is haptic, that our experience of it is probably as sensorial as this pandemic that you feel we can't touch, that we feel we can't touch or see, though I can't help but think about Robert Barry's Inert Gases when I think about this, and something that has had such a radical shift in the experience of the beings around it, and how art and the non-linguistic allows us to get to that space. And I think this is one of the richnesses of this project that cannot be played out in our 90 minutes, nor when removed from the actual relationality of those pieces. I am very grateful to have all of your actual voices here, I will admit, because I think that each of you have brought a unique cadence to this conversation. There's a great chat going on that I'm super excited and somewhat schizophrenically returning back and forth from. So please excuse me if I'm not as on the ball as I dream of being one day. But I'm looking at something, it's a question that of course is close to my heart. So I want to bring it back in, which is a question around, let me see. It's a simple, described as a simple question, but I don't think it's a simple question at all. From your perspective, how listening can be an act of resistance and or healing. And I know that it's been very important in the conversation here to describe, the question is what constitutes a sensory difference, and how do we get away from a unitary idea of sensoria? How do we problematize and redistribute or take back in from exile those sensibilities? But this question has already brought up chats of Dylan Robinson's Hungry Listening, which I think is deeply apt. But within that conversation, can you imagine sensorial shifts like listening being an act of resistance and or healing? And I'd like to maybe throw this back to Kite, because I feel that you are the one that has most addressed listening internally to the project. And I find that work so rich with regards to this. So I'm wondering if you might speak again to that, Kite.
Sure. Yeah, I think about listening a lot as a composer and a sound person, but I think specifically for this piece, the way listening is very much helping me think about the body as, and think about, there's something that I have not fully researched yet, and so it's the status of, I talk a lot about ontology and the status of non-human, but there's something special about the Lakota ontological sense of the body and things that go on the body and wearables, and that's where I get to the hair braid ideas, where it's both these objects, or even the body seen as an object, are both animate and have volition in themselves. Ideas I'm taking from Posthumous and channels. And I think that the status of being both animate and channel at the same time is, I'm also looking at the chat, is not hierarchical. There is hierarchy, and I think that there's a lot to be explored there, and this is, can't even pin down what listening really is, listening to beyond. But actually, I really wanted to hear what that's yeah, I'm really curious about Ree's ideas around this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was just sitting here thinking about my journey around this kind of, particularly through this project, has been probably more. It's probably been the major change, I guess, in my practice, because I think what I experienced when I began to make this work was I approached it from an intellectual perspective, and of course that just really didn't work, and it made me kind of go back and think about my actual physical connection to country, the physical sense of walking on country. Of course, there's an element of reflecting through memory, but I kept trying to bring the sense back to the immediate moment, and I guess being present in the moment. And I think the thing that I realized about my practice-driven kind of research and the spaces in which I've kind of worked and occupied and been educated have been problematic. And so they were my obstacles, really. I had to challenge those obstacles to come back into the physical sense of being now, to have that walking experience, and to realize that language in itself has been something that I aspired to grab hold of and understand, and it ends up being the problem in my work, because it creates a connection to the colonial script. And so it was a struggle to come back to just the center of my relationship to my country, to my, it's an ancestral energy thing for me. And I think all Indigenous people have some relationship and connection to that. We experience it differently. We experience it how we come to it in different ways. But what I have learnt to do for me is to be open to that energy, and not to be fearful of that energy, because the fear of that energy comes from the prescriptions of colonization. And so that's been my journey. And the idea of taking this work in itself into that physical space is about hopefully bringing other people into a sense of some moments of that experience that I've been through personally for myself. It's also that reflection of the pieces of who we are. You know, I've been told, like many of us, who we should be. And this journey through the senses and the connection to country and their energy experiences I've had are really about embracing the diversity of who I am, because there's many of who I am that make up this one person. And a big part of who I am in the world, not just as an Indigenous person, I'm also queer. And so that language in itself has been, you know, oppressed. So it's a physical energy experience that I'm trying to bring into my work, not language.
That describes a kind of receptivity that it can be arguably considered to be a form of listening, that the potential to receive those vibrations, you know, arguably the sonic is vibration as interpreted by various membranes, be they the skin or other, and to think about this idea of your receptivity being somehow epigenetically driven might be part of this conversation around what constitutes sensory difference. Like when you make this call to the ancestors, when you describe this ancestry that is present in what you are able to receive, I think that that might be part of this larger conversation, or articulate at least a moment of it. I'm well aware we're getting quite close to the end here, and I had promised Florencia Marchetti that she would have an opportunity to bring some things forward with regards to the project, because obviously this is a very important moment to be at ISEA all together having this particular conversation, but it also is an important moment of the iteration of this project. So Florencia Marchetti, I am very glad to see you again, by the way. It's lovely to see your face, even though you're so far away. So thank you to all the panelists for what you've done right now. That's my alarm telling me to do this. So if you don't mind, Florencia, I'd invite you now to take some time to describe what you had wanted to. And if there's a moment after, we'll discuss some more.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jake, for making this little time possible. We just want to invite everyone there on the other side to further engage with this work. We have created a web platform because this is what's available to us for the moment. And these different iterations that we have been working on this last few months, pandemic months, are actually posted there. So you can all go visit, listen, headphones on ideally, further engage, think, and register if you want to participate in one of our sensory lab sessions, so we can further, you know, elaborate on the ideas, the works, the ontologies that we've all been entangled with in this years of working together. So I'm going to post the link on the chat, so people can copy and paste and visit. We're actually launching this web platform today, so it's a big moment for us going public. We had planned doing our first install during ISEA when it was planned for May, right? And it was going to be a body-to-body encounter, but as we all know, all our plans have been deeply interrupted and changed. But we're excited to share this and to encounter whoever is interested and willing in further engaging. So I'm going to copy the link in the chat.
Thank you very much, Florencia, for bringing that forward. And well, this will return to the idea of the anthropological and the perhaps notions of data sharing and other complications around them. This is a very rich opportunity. It's also been brought up in the chat that people are thinking about Schwartz's contact zones and third spaces. And I think this, to return to space before we leave a conversation such as this, is a valuable conclusion, to think about those in-between spaces and their multiplicity. Of course, third space and fourth space are ideas that have been brought forward in many ways. And I can't help but think of sort of my primary point of meeting that idea was with Henri Lefebvre. And when Lefebvre described that in order to change life, we would have to change space, I felt it was an incredible provocation, and something that I think is matched by this kind of engagement that we're having here, where our potential to engage space has been shifted so drastically by the confines of a virus that has created such unevenness, or laid bare the unevenness that was already here, but has provided this opportunity for curious evening of experience as well. So we have 4 minutes left. I can't believe there's extra time. I would like to know if someone on the panel would like to speak more directly to any of what has just happened.
Maybe I'll make a comment about the decolonizing effort. I'm suspicious of decolonizing, indigenizing. The panel already knows that. Indigenizing really is about Indigenous people taking from the dominant culture the tools that they need and making them their own. And I think that this design has allowed us to do that, not only just the technical support, but also I'm a lot friendlier with anthropology because I've met some real anthropologists with heart and who are willing to listen and meet us halfway. And to that comment about listening, I know Dylan well, but I haven't read his book, but I'm going to guess that the colonial listening is a listening for. And I found at times some of my anthropological colleagues were listening for something, and sometimes we were resisting and not giving it to them. And sometimes it provoked us to go back and think about what we had and to represent it in a different way. I thought that was very generous without being a mining operation. And so there was a co-creation of, in some cases, new objects and new knowledge that I didn't anticipate, and I was very suspicious at the beginning. The decolonial project I'm suspicious of because it imagines a utopia, and as a former Roman Catholic and other Indigenous friends who've been Christianized, there's always this towards this future thing, which is totally against Indigenous concepts of time. And I'm interested in non-colonial practices. So for me, this maybe people feel there's decolonizing, but I don't know what the product of a decolonized whatever would look like. No one's articulated for me. But I do know what non-colonial projects are, and they don't attempt to colonize. So instead of listening for, my partners in this collaboration were listening with and allowed me to listen as well. And to me, that was the most productive outcome of this whole project.
That's a remarkable place to conclude, because it points to the failure within utopian projects, because they imagine, first of all, a blank slate of origin, and we cannot come from a blank slate. And it definitely points to the idea of a refusal of extraction, and that reference of extraction to imagine what will be there already, and what you're able to retrieve from an experience is to actually not listen at all. So I want to thank all of you for such a rich opportunity to speak with you. Thank you for sharing your works with us. And I'm very grateful for all you've said, and I hope to be speaking again with you soon. Thank you so very much. And please do look at the chat. It's exciting. Bye for